When making an argument about a literary text, one of the first things you'll often do is go back through that text and find specific quotes that you think will back up the points you're trying to make. If used effectively, these quotes will serve as evidence for the argument that you're making. In this presentation, I'll walk you through a series of steps that you'll want to take in order to transform your quotes into convincing evidence. Sometimes these steps can be difficult to remember, so another way to think of these steps for effectively using evidence is in terms of creating a good quote sandwich. So what are the steps for effectively using evidence? Well, to effectively use your evidence, you need to state your point, you need to signal your quotation, you need to provide context, you need to quote only what's necessary and cite your quote using proper MLA citation, and you need to explain your evidence. Let's take a few minutes to look at each of these steps more carefully. The first step is stating your point. Before you introduce and include a quotation or paraphrase, it's important to prepare your readers by letting them know what it is they're supposed to be getting from this quote, what the point is, in other words, of including it. Thus, you need to state what you're trying to demonstrate or prove with your evidence, that is, with your quote, before you even include it. You may feel like you've now sufficiently set up your quote, but to do this well, there are still a few more steps you need to follow. After you've stated your point, you're still going to need to signal your quotation. It's important to always signal your quotes or otherwise integrate them into your writing, even if it's only by including the words "so-and-so says." This is part of what makes your argument yours rather than a stringing together of someone else's ideas. If any sentence in your paper begins and ends with quotation marks, something called a floating quotation, you are not writing. The person you're citing is. In addition to signaling your quote, you also need to provide context or background for your quote. Here are some tips for doing that. First of all, never introduce a quotation by simply stating the line number or the page number on which the quote appears. Something like, on page 33. This is only useful for someone who is looking at the literary work as she reads your paper. And it's going to make your reader cranky if she needs to go back and look through the text to figure out what's going on. So instead, you should carefully set up the background of any quotation that you use, in other words, what's happening at that moment in the text, so that the meaning of the passage and the reason it helps your argument is clear. It is important to note that you might sometimes provide context before you signal your quote, or you might provide some context while signaling your quote. The important thing is that both of these, signaling and contextualizing, happen before you bring in your quote. At this point, you can now finally bring in the quotation that you found. But do remember that you should only quote what's necessary to make your point, and you should then cite your quotation. Generally speaking, you should only quote parts of the work that will help demonstrate your point. Many people mistakenly think that a quotation has to be a whole sentence, but you can quote however much or however little you need to make your point. This might sometimes be a sentence or two, or it might be much less. Remember, you can selectively quote words or phrases instead of whole sentences, or you can leave out words or even whole sentences in a longer passage if they're unnecessary for making your point. To show that you've omitted something from a quote, simply use ellipses, those 3 spaced periods that you'll sometimes see within a quotation. You might also want to see pages 46 to 50 in Reading and Writing About Literature for additional tips about quoting, and pages 150 to 154 for reminders about proper MLA in-text citation. The Purdue Online Writing Lab website, also referred to as the Purdue OWL website, is also a good resource for citation questions you may have. The final step in effectively using evidence is explaining your evidence. Once you've gone to the trouble of introducing and contextualizing your quote, quoting it, and citing it, you may feel like you're done. However, you still need to provide some follow-up after your quote where you analyze the quote and explain how it helps to further your argument or illustrate the point you're trying to make. To be clear, explaining your evidence doesn't mean simply summing up what the quote says, but rather telling us what we should notice about the quote. This may sound like a lot to remember, so keeping this image in mind might help you. Basically, what you're trying to do in following all of those steps is create a quote sandwich. Here's how it breaks down. Think of the quote itself as the meat in the sandwich. Okay, while it's a key part of the sandwich, unless you're a vegetarian, without the rest of the components, it's just a piece of meat. So in order to create a sandwich, you need bread and other toppings. The top slice of bread is where you state your point right at the start of the paragraph. Now, technically, a sandwich could consist of just meat and bread, but a really good sandwich also includes other things like lettuce, tomato, and cheese on top of that meat. Think of these toppings as where you introduce or signal your quote and provide necessary background. Now, without the bread on the bottom of your sandwich, you just have a stack of ingredients, so you don't want to forget to finish making your sandwich with that final slice of bread. That final slice of bread is where you analyze your quote and explain how it helps to demonstrate your initial point. So this is all fine and good in theory, but let's see how it works using a quote from Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Yellow Wallpaper. First, here's a sample paragraph that is not effectively sandwiching its quote. It reads, "As the narrator descends into madness, she regresses and becomes more childlike. Then I got so angry I bit off a little piece at one corner, but it hurt my teeth." The paragraph does begin with a statement of the point the student's attempting to make, but there's no transition into the quote, leaving the reader with an abrupt floating quotation and with no clear idea of who is speaking or what this person bit. Plus, there's no explanation of what in this quote shows that the narrator is becoming childlike. A reader looking at just this might think this quote makes the narrator sound animalistic, not childish, because there's no explanation of what we should be paying attention to here. Even adding a sentence to the end of this paragraph, it still does not mean that the paragraph is fulfilling all of the criteria for effectively sandwiching this quote. For example, "As the narrator descends into madness, she regresses and becomes more childlike. Then I got so angry, I bit off a little piece at one corner, but it hurt my teeth." She's clearly acting childlike. Although the student has added a sentence following the quotation, saying that something is clearly the case is not really an example of analyzing your quote to show how it demonstrates your point. Plus, the added sentence does not explain how this quotation demonstrates that the narrator is acting childlike. In fact, as I mentioned before, while one reader might come to that conclusion, another reader might see this act as animalistic rather than childlike. Thus, it's your job as a writer to guide your reader to the conclusion that you'd like the reader to reach by pointing out what we should be noticing in the quotation that you've used. This paragraph does a much better job of effectively sandwiching this same quote. This paragraph reads, "As the narrator descends into madness, she regresses and becomes more childlike. Near the end of her time in the house she and her husband have rented, the narrator becomes more and more crazed, attempting to remove all of the wallpaper. At one point, she even tries and fails to move the bed that's bolted to the floor so she can get more wallpaper off. When the bed doesn't move, she exclaims, quote, 'Then I got so angry I bit off a little piece at one corner, but it hurt my teeth.' Biting a piece off of a bed sounds like something a child would do during a temper tantrum, not something a rational adult would do. The fact that she adds that, quote, 'it hurt my teeth,' suggests that she was surprised that it would have hurt, which is a reaction that we would associate more with a child than with an adult who would know better." Since this is a longer paragraph, I'll give you a moment to read over the paragraph again yourself before I begin to break it down. Here we have the same quote as the previous paragraph, properly cited this time, and highlighted in pink here. Plus, notice how this paragraph states the point the writer intends to make, contextualizes the quote, signals the quote, analyzes the quote in order to explain how it helps to make the initial point. This paragraph is much more effectively sandwiching this quotation than the previous paragraph that we looked at. And in the process, this writer is turning what could just be cut and pasted information into good evidence for the point the writer wishes to make. Plus, when done well, this kind of paragraph is also the answer to the age-old question of, how will I ever get my paper up to that many pages? This method transforms a two-line quote into a fully developed paragraph, and it does so not with filler, but by carefully guiding the reader through the writer's argument. I hope you will practice using this method as you work on your essays for this class. Good luck!